Hey, what's up, everybody? Thanks for tapping into this episode of Do Your Homework. We're going to talk about debate number 2 today. Before we do that, I want to do a little bit better of a deep dive, explain to you guys what Vivek's position on the Ukraine and Taiwan is. And then we're going to talk about a little bit of the heat he took going into the second debate, and then we'll talk about the second debate. So get right into it. Vivek's Russia deal essentially is to freeze the current lines of control. Part of the reason you would do that is because the regions that are currently under Russian control right now, Zaporizhzhia, Luhansk, Donetsk, Crimea, it's all part of the greater Donbass region. These are Russian-speaking regions, and they have been at odds. There was an election in 2014 where a very, very corrupt party or group came into power. There were revolts in Crimea. There were revolts in eastern Ukraine because these people had and continued to basically discriminate against Russian-speaking people in the same way that basically Jim Crow discriminated against blacks. It's much the same thing, except for instead of having private citizens doing the lynching, this was like state-sponsored artillery shelling of their own people. Okay, this has been going on since 2014. All right, so Vivek's thing is like, look, these are Russian-speaking people. They don't want to be part of Ukraine because they're not being represented in the Ukraine government. It doesn't really make any difference if they pay taxes to Putin or Zelensky. So if they want to pay taxes to Putin, let's let them. All right, so that's why you freeze the current lines of control. And Ukraine gets to keep their sovereignty. I got news for you guys. They're never gonna get south of the Dnipro River, and it's only a matter of time before they run out of men. They're going to run out of men and material long before the Russians do. So if they keep this up, they're going to lose. So they get to keep their sovereignty, and Russia gets to, the parts that are currently under Russian occupation would remain part of the Russian Federation, which is what those people likely want anyway, as we said. Hard commitment, Ukraine will not enter NATO. As of 1990, with the dissolution of the USSR, literally the only reason that the Russians even agreed to such a dissolution and to the Budapest Memorandum in general is because we agreed that we would not move NATO 1 inch past Germany. And since then, we've extended into Poland, Sweden, the Balkans, and now they were talking about adding NATO. He's like, no, this goes against the Budapest Memorandum. This is not the deal that we made. I will not have a hostile, authoritarian weirdo who is shelling people who I identify with. Okay, these are our people, and I can show you guys a map of Europe. Ukraine literally never exists until 1991. It's always been a part of the Rus. It was originally called the Kievan Rus. They're all Russian people, okay? So he's like, these are my people. I'm not just going to let them fall under an authoritarian regime that is now a NATO ally. So that's part of the reason that they started the war to begin with. He wants to normalize economic relationships with the West and Russia. This is what the Russians want, as I touched on in that last video. They do not view themselves as Asian. It was actually the Muscovite Rus who had to fought off and win their independence back from the Mongols when they came from the East in the 13th century. So they don't view themselves as Asian. They for better or worse, they don't. You can call me racist, you can call me whatever you want. I'm just telling you guys the facts. They don't view themselves as Asian. They don't want to do business in Asia. They would prefer to do business with the Euros. And then Russia must exit its military alliance with China. Again, they've never had a strong relationship with the Chinese. They don't want strong relations in Asia. They don't care for them. Okay, they feel right now like they're being crowded out of their own continent, which they pretty much effectively are. And so I understand their frustration. But this is certainly a deal that Putin would take. And ideally, one of the assurances that you would get that Putin would keep this deal is that he would continue supplying arms to India and Vietnam, which he's been doing. Right? So ideally, he would exit, not only would he exit his military alliance with China, he would continue supplying arms to India and Vietnam while we continue supplying arms to Japan and Korea, and we could begin to build an actual ring around the Chinese sphere of influence. All right, because what Putin doesn't want is some sort of bilateral, or especially not a unilateral, form of international governments where China's on top because Russia's economically dependent on them for, like we talked about last week, and where the U.S. is economically dependent on them for things that I talked about in my last episode. So that's not what either of us want. What we would prefer is a trilateral system of balance of power, basically, where you have Russia, the U.S., and China. But in order to do that, you have to allow Russia its sphere of influence. You have to. You have to allow them their sphere of influence. You have to give them their sphere of control. They have to have significant leverage to operate. And it's not a horrible thing. It's not a horrible thing. Okay? And in doing so, you're actually going to enrich NATO countries because they're going to benefit from all the trade with the Russians, and they're going to enrich themselves, and in turn, they will actually be better allies. Right? Now, obviously, it's going to be a lot, when you get pen to paper, it's going to be a lot more sticky than that. There's going to be a lot more legalese in there. There's obviously going to be some hard red lines that, if crossed, would result in immediate termination of the treaty. But that is a deal that Putin would take. Assuming otherwise shows me that you have no sort of feel for the situation. You have no sort of understanding of the history and how these people identify. Okay, Russia has wanted normal economic relations with the West since 1945. Okay, and the only reason they haven't is because of this generations-long dick-swinging contest that started with Truman and Stalin that we can get into at a later time, because I do think it's important for you guys to understand how we got here with the Russians. As far as Taiwan goes, we rely on them for semiconductors until we can desource that and not rely on them for semiconductors. He says that we will defend them militarily from invasion from China, and then at which point we will resume the current posture, the Nikki Haley posture of strategic ambiguity. Why is that important? Well, I don't want to die in a Russian civil war over Ukraine any more than I want to die in a Chinese civil war over Taiwan. That's just not our business, okay? It's simply not. These places need to defend themselves. They need to make their own weapons. They need to fight their own wars. They have men to do these things for them. Taiwan, luckily, is an island. So it's not as if the Chinese can just march over there. It's a lot more complicated than that, right? So they have time to prepare, but they need to do that. All right, let's get into debate number 2. Leading up into it, Vivek obviously took a lot of criticism for being contrarian on the foreign policy stance, which I think is the deepest ideological divide in the Republican Party. So they threw a whole bunch of crap at him from debate number 1 to debate number 2. I'm going to put a link in the description. You guys can go in there and actually look at all the things that came up. He addressed all of them, beat back all of them. We get into debate number 2. It's not even a thing. So debate number 2, it was a complete shit show. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. I think this will only take about 5 minutes for me to get through. Ron DeSantis was steady Eddie. I thought he was, again, he talks loud and says the obvious. He's not a bad guy. I think he's a good dude. And I think he wants to do right by the country, and I think he's smart enough to recognize that the progressive woke agenda is bullshit. And I'm glad he's strong enough to say something about it. He did have one moment where Nikki Haley called him out for not allowing fracking in Florida, even though he's such a big proponent of it nationwide, part of his platform as far as his candidacy goes. I'm not an expert on this at all, but I do understand that when you're fracking for oil, you're actually drilling deep into the ground, deep into rock, actually. And so when he didn't allow it to happen off the Florida coast isn't made out of hard rock like Texas, right? There's softer limestone off the coast of Florida. So there's a lot more risk involved with fracking down there. And instead of just saying that, he lied and said that didn't happen. Like it would have been a simple phase to say, look, the rock there is not solid enough for that. The risk reward was too heavy. I couldn't take it. And instead of saying that, he folded like Al's card. Was like, oh, I didn't. Yeah, you did, bro. Just say that. You know what I'm saying? If you're going to fold like that in front of Nikki Haley, what are you going to do in a room with Xi Jinping? or Putin. Like, bro, just go back to the governor's office in Tallahassee and live your life. He didn't have to do this. I don't know why he did it. Speaking of Nikki Haley, man, guys, I didn't realize how wrong she was on some of these things till I went back and actually listened to what she had to say, and then I realized this. Oh my God! All right, let's get right into it. This time it was about healthcare. Okay, so she says the obvious: the costs are too high. Without saying anything about why costs are high or how she's going to bring the cost down. She says we need to open up transparency. Okay, where? To what degree? Didn't even come close to talking about that. She talked about getting rid of, she said, quote, we need to get rid of certificate of needs and then make them compete. I was like, okay, well, who's them? What is a certificate of need? I looked up a certificate of need. And it's basically if you want to start a healthcare provider service as either a business or a developer, if you want to build something like a hospital or if you want to rent out a space and be like an eye doctor, you have to get a certificate of need in that state. All right, it's a statewide thing. This isn't even a federal issue, right? So she's running for president talking about a state's issue. Okay, well, what did you do as the head of the state? You were a governor, right? So surely you got rid of certificate of needs in your own state. No, she didn't. South Carolina is a certificate of need state. Never even touched it. So you didn't touch this issue when you were governor, and you expect me to believe that you're going to touch this issue now as president? Give me a fucking break. No, you're not. You're just talking out of your ass to get votes. It's so annoying. She further talks about the need for patients needing freedom of choice in healthcare plans, but then she doesn't address why they don't have freedom of choice currently. Why don't they have freedom of choice, Nikki? And what are you going to do about getting them that choice? Didn't say anything about it, but again, we don't just bash on people. We do our homework. There are antitrust exemptions for health insurance providers. Antitrust laws that would typically say, this is a monopoly. We got to break this up. Okay, but they have antitrust exemptions that allow them to just get away with bullshit. And so there's no competition in the marketplace. There's no new competitors to try the incumbency at all. And so when you have a monopoly market, and we'll get into more of this here in a second, when we talk about Doug Burgum's response to this, but when you have a monopoly in the market, things get more expensive, they get less efficient, and they actually the quality becomes of a lesser quality. That happens almost all the time in a monopoly market. Unless it's a market designed for a monopoly. I'll give you an example. Your local power grid. It'd be impossible to have service a subdivision with 6 different utilities companies. It'd be too complicated, right? So in that sort of marketplace, yes, you do end up with a lot of waste, but you also end up with the most efficient means and actually the lowest prices for the industry, because the industry requires economies of scale to work. That's beyond the scope of this talk right now, but I wanted to kind of give you guys a general understanding of how that worked. Again, right after she answered that, she proceeds to get owned by Doug Burgum, who points out something that I didn't even know. This is something I learned by listening to him. I guess when Obamacare was made, the government subsidized a certain IT software that was supposed to help doctors and service care providers. Help with what? I don't know. Streamline information, maybe. Fuck, who knows? Who cares? But Doug Burgum correctly points out this is wild. United States healthcare is the only industry in the world to absorb $1 trillion in IT and become less productive. Right? So he points to, we've all been in the office and we have the doctor and he's sitting behind us on a keyboard. That IT system is actually making them less productive. So they're seeing less patients every day and costs are going up. It's ridiculous. And so he made this note at the end of his comments where he said, every time government gets involved in picking winners and losers in the marketplace, the product in question gets more expensive, there's less competition, leads to goods and services of a lesser quality. It's the exact same thing when you have the monopoly power in the health insurance antitrust exemptions. Whenever the government gets involved and says, okay, well, this is an antitrust exemption, but okay, we're going to subsidize these people, you fuck the whole industry. And so that's essentially what happened, and she didn't come anywhere near close to addressing that. but then she gets an applause like she's talking about something. She's not. Doug Burgum also made a fantastic, I'm telling you guys, he's probably my second favorite candidate right now. Dougie Beast, a man. But he made a second comment about taking his business-like approach to governance. He said, in North Dakota, we treat the taxpayer like a customer. And that's essentially what it is. The taxpayer is your customer. That's an awesome way to put it. Because the government here in the U.S., especially here in the U.S., is a service provider. All right, they are meant to provide government goods and services for their constituents who pay them via tax revenue. Okay, and when you take this approach, this business-like approach to it, you become more efficient. You actually optimize your goods and services for your constituents, and you're more likely to think outside the box to get things done because you're taking a business-like approach to it, right? And then you treat your actual staff, it's not just state staff, they're your employees. And so when you take this business-like approach to it, you begin optimizing every facet of your organization. That's what Donald Trump, for better or worse in his stint, brought to the White House. And that's what I think Vivek is going to bring to the White House in spades. I think Doug Burgum would definitely bring that to a cabinet position. I hope he gets one because he is the man. All right. Let's wrap this up with Vivek Ramaswamy, sharp as usual. This is the one where he was the only one with the balls to say that transgenderism, aka gender dysphoria, is in fact a mental illness. For those of you who do not believe me, I do have a copy of the DSM-5. I'd be happy to read it to you. It's certainly in there. He did get into a spat with Nikki Haley. This is the part where she said, "I feel dumber every time I listen to you speak." Only to completely misquote everything he said. So it's like, did you actually listen to him speak, or you just start stupid? You just start stupid. Okay. So basically what had happened was Vivek was talking about TikTok and social media apps, and he was saying that, I joined TikTok to try to reach young voters. And if we're going to win an election, we have to be able to reach young voters. We cannot rely on 55 and over senior living communities to keep voting us into office. It's not how this works. Okay, a majority of the voter pool is under the age of 40. Many of them are on TikTok. We have to reach them. Basically what he said. And then he said, if you're a person under the age of 16, you should not have addictive social media. Sounds sensible. She proceeds to say, you want our kids on these apps. We need to ban TikTok. Blah, 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 blah. Completely ignoring the fact that there are studies out there that show young people would sooner give up their right to vote than give up TikTok, and ignoring the fact that her own daughter currently at that time was on TikTok, which will get brought up in debate number 3, and she gets mad about that. How are you going to get mad? You can't ban TikTok in your own house. You want to ban it for the whole country? Hypocrisy. It's ridiculous. Like, she talks out of her ass. And then she's like, oh, you want our kids on? No, I don't want our kids on it. I literally just said I don't want anybody under the age of 16 on TikTok. That's literally, and then she addresses the end without addressing the means. She sits there and says, oh, we have to ban TikTok. Well, Vivek goes after her and says, well, Nikki, it's easy to say you're going to ban TikTok. Why don't you ban Airbnb by that case? Why don't you ban any of these other companies that are willingly handing our data over to the CCP? What we have to do is actually attack the root of the problem. No forced data transfers to the CCP. Period. Why won't you say that? She can't say that because Larry Fink, Jamie Dimon, her donors are making too much money in China to let her say that. So it's crazy, man. It's a really messed up game. We'll be getting into debate number 3 here shortly. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Do Your Homework. We'll be getting into, like I said, the lead up of debate number 3 and then debate number 3, which was a doozy. I think this is where Vivek really stamped himself as the best candidate on stage. So like I said, stay tuned in, y'all. I'll let you know when it comes out. Till next time.